Capitol Hill had never been quiet. Even when the air wasn't full of shouting, there was a kind of static, a restless, practiced urgency humming beneath polished shoes and clipped greetings. But that morning, the noise was different. It was budget season, the kind of hearing no one expects to go viral. No shouting matches, no dramatic speeches, just paper. Rows and rows of budget lines, categories, reauthorizations, and fiscal justifications that most of America would never see, much less understand. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat in her usual seat, third from the end, left side of the panel. Her posture was composed, her blazer crisp. She had 3 tabs open on her tablet, and a 4th document was slowly loading, a PDF titled FY25 Auxiliary Appropriations Review, Border Operations, Youth Infrastructure. Routine, bureaucratic, unremarkable. Until it wasn't. Midway through a junior staffer's presentation, Jasmine's eyes paused on page 42. One line. It wasn't highlighted. It didn't have a note. But something about it didn't sit right. Line 813D. Dispersed to Future Front Foundation for Development of Temporary Juvenile Aid Structures along Southern Entry Zones. She read it again. Future Front. That name stirred something not from Capitol briefings, but from a memory, a closed-door meeting from 3 years earlier. A nonprofit once listed in the appendices of a separate hearing, tied indirectly to border subcontractors. She tapped the name. No hyperlink. She turned to Lane Robbins, her chief of staff seated behind her. Quietly, without looking away from the screen, she murmured, "Get me everything you can find on Future Front, especially board affiliations." Lane leaned forward slightly. "Now?" Jasmine nodded once. "Before this hearing ends." No one else noticed the shift. A Republican colleague from Texas continued outlining the importance of streamlined infrastructure for juvenile holding centers. Jasmine flipped to the next page of the document. More funds. $3.8 million allocated in the previous fiscal year. Same recipient. Same language. And then, on page 44, the detail that landed like a cold pebble in the pit of her stomach. Filed through honorary channels. Office of the former First Lady. No name, just the title, but everyone knew who that meant. She didn't raise her voice, didn't interrupt. She sat still, stylus in hand, blinking only once as the hearing droned on. Outwardly, she looked the same, the calm, poised Congresswoman flipping between documents, asking sharp, well-timed questions when called on. But inside, something had shifted. Because now, she wasn't reading numbers. She was reading ghosts. Jasmine remembered the photos, the ones that made headlines for a week and then disappeared. Rows of children in silver blankets, eyes puffy from crying, holding each other because there was no one else to hold. She remembered how those images had gone viral in 2018, prompting outrage, then exhaustion, then silence. And she remembered something else, something quieter. A woman, Spanish-speaking, late 30s, sitting across from her in a detention facility in Dallas back when Jasmine was a public defender. The woman had been separated from her 6-year-old daughter at the border. No court notice, no translator, no record of transfer, just processing delays. Her voice was low, barely a whisper. Mi hija, ella solo pregunta porque nadie le explica. My daughter, she just keeps asking why no one explains. And now, in front of her, a budget line, a foundation, and the quiet shadow of someone who had once claimed to be best. It would have been so easy to ignore. Most people would have. There was nothing illegal in the document, nothing scandalous on its face. But the question wasn't legality. It was morality. Why was a foundation loosely affiliated with a former First Lady tied to border infrastructure labeled for children? Why was it hidden behind innocuous language like temporary juvenile aid? And most of all, why had no one asked? The hearing ended at 3 p.m. Staffers shuffled papers, pleasantries were exchanged, and journalists milled at the back hoping for quotes. Jasmine gathered her tablet slowly, stood, nodded to the chair, and exited without a word to the press. Outside the chamber, Lane caught up to her, folder in hand. Future Front has no clear website, she began. The registered address leads to a third-party legal firm. But, she handed Jasmine a single printed page. One of the board members is Camilla Horvath, former PR coordinator for the East Wing during Melania's tenure. Jasmine didn't react. She just took the paper and looked at it. There was no need to jump, no need to accuse, not yet. That wasn't her way. But something had shifted. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that this wasn't just a budget anomaly. It was something else. Something that, if followed, could pull threads the public hadn't even seen dangling. The kind of thread that looks like nothing until it unravels everything. She slid the paper into her folder and simply said, "Let's trace it." And that's how it began. Not with a headline, not with a shout, but with a line item no one saw. By the end of that week, Jasmine Crockett had reviewed over 600 pages of budget documentation, most of it printed, spread across her conference table in patterns only she seemed to understand. Lane had given up trying to keep them categorized. The staff intern from Howard had tried color coding. Didn't help, because what they were looking for wasn't obvious. They weren't searching for fraud or embezzlement. That would have been cleaner, easier. They were following a trail of deliberate vagueness. On the third night, as the sun dipped low behind the Capitol dome, Jasmine stood alone in the quiet of her office. The only sound was the soft hum of the HVAC and the rustle of papers beneath her fingertips. She paused over a form stamped with the words, "Expedited Development, Youth Contingency Zone C." What kind of phrase was that? Contingency zone, not a school, not a clinic, not even a shelter. It didn't say who built the zone. It didn't say where it was. But the funding came from Future Front Foundation, the same name that had now appeared in 5 different fiscal reports under 5 different aliases. And somewhere, tied loosely to it all, was the former First Lady's name. Jasmine didn't say it aloud. She didn't have to, because in that silence, memory did the speaking. She saw her own mother back in Dallas shaking her head as the evening news played footage of children behind fencing, crying for parents they couldn't see. "They got babies in cages," her mother had whispered, and people still talking about decorum. That word always stuck with Jasmine. Decorum, a polite way to ask someone to be quiet while the world burned around them. She sat down at her desk and opened a separate file, one the media had long stopped paying attention to, a 2019 field report from a legal observer at the Yuma border facility. It contained line after line of observations, some redacted, some not. Page 12. A mural of the First Lady in the front corridor reads, "Be best. Children pass by this sign on the way to their bunks." Jasmine leaned back slowly, her hand resting against her temple. She wasn't looking for blame. She wasn't hunting scandal. She just couldn't unsee it now. Why was the image of grace used to soften the architecture of cruelty? Lane walked in without knocking. They had long passed the point of formalities. He held a folder. Another trace, a grant from 2021, listed under juvenile mental health programming. Guess who administered it? Future Front, Jasmine said flatly. Future Front under the name Childwell Collaborative. The address is the same, the signatory's name? Lane handed her the form. Jasmine scanned it, and there it was. Not Melania Trump, but someone who had stood next to her at dozens of press events, the foundation's executive secretary, who once coordinated photo ops with child literacy groups. And now, quietly, she had signed off on facility expansions near Hidalgo County. Jasmine didn't speak. She just circled the name and passed the form back. For a moment, Lane stood in silence. Then, gently, he asked, "You want to stop?" She looked up at him, eyes soft but unwavering. "You think I'm doing this to go viral again?" "No," Lane said. "I think you're doing this because no one else will." She nodded once, then returned to the documents. Because for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't a story about Melania Trump. It wasn't about partisanship. It was about how silence gets institutionalized, how the symbols of compassion get used to camouflage the mechanics of harm. 3 days later, Jasmine sat in a private briefing with staff attorneys. No cameras, no press, just truth and discomfort. She asked one question: is there a direct legal violation here? Silence. Then one lawyer answered carefully: no, but it raises serious ethical questions. Foundations with federal affiliations aren't supposed to fund enforcement adjacent facilities, at least not without disclosure. Another added, and if that disclosure gets buried under rebranded shell foundations, the trail evaporates. Jasmine folded her hands. Until someone chooses to follow it. And she had. But the deeper she dug, the more something else began to haunt her. Not just the money, not just the names. The faces. Not the ones on TV. The ones in the folders. Photos attached to old legal affidavits. Drawings made by children. Crayons on legal pads. A house with a fence. A mother holding hands with a child. The child always smiling. The mother never had a face. Jasmine had kept one of those drawings from a case in 2016, a boy named Esteban. He'd been 9 when ICE took him and his mother from their apartment. Jasmine fought for a bond hearing, lost the case, and later found the drawing in her file. She kept it, not because she won, but because it reminded her why she stayed angry. Now, years later, she was holding documents stamped by nonprofits that had once issued press releases about compassion, while quietly signing checks for Youth Contingency Zone C. So no, she wasn't smiling. But she wasn't flinching either. Outside her office, Washington was doing what it always did. Moving on. New hearings. New narratives. Loudness as distraction. But Jasmine knew something most people didn't. That the most dangerous injustice isn't the one that screams. It's the one that whispers through spreadsheets. The one that hides in the white space between budget lines. The one that gets printed, filed, approved, and forgotten. Unless someone decides not to forget. And Jasmine Crockett had made up her mind. She would ask the question, not as an attack, not as an accusation, but as a mirror, one that wouldn't crack. The room was packed. Not because of controversy, not yet. It was the usual budget subcommittee on infrastructure allocations. Cameras were present, but half asleep. A few journalists, most of them interns or second-tier correspondents, milled about the back rows, typing notes they assumed no one would read. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat near the center of the dais. Same seat, same poise. She looked like any other lawmaker flipping through notes until you noticed what she wasn't doing. She wasn't blinking. Her eyes were trained on a single document, held in a loose grip between thumb and forefinger. It was the FY25 funding memo she'd spent the last week dissecting. Only now, she had added something. Red circles, handwritten notes, and a single sticky tab marking one section. Future Front Foundation. She hadn't told anyone she was going to bring it up. Not Lane, not the committee chair, not even the reporters who occasionally tried to bait her with softball questions. This wasn't going to be a performance, it was going to be a question. One the room had never heard. She waited. Let the numbers roll. Let the polite justifications play out. Let the chairman thank panelists for their transparency. Then her name was called. Congresswoman Crockett, you have 5 minutes. Jasmine leaned forward, clicked her microphone on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, she began. Her voice was calm, controlled. I've been reviewing the FY25 allocations, particularly in the category labeled Youth Contingency Infrastructure and Aid Programs. A nod from the budget analyst. Nothing unusual yet. She continued. One recurring recipient stood out to me, the Future Front Foundation, previously listed in FY23 and FY24 under varying aliases, including Childwell Collaborative and Frontier Promise. A few heads turned. One staffer scribbled something. Jasmine held the document in front of her. All 3 received federal support totaling $11.2 million over the last 4 years, designated for juvenile support near border zones. According to IRS nonprofit records, they share a common legal address, overlapping boards, and, in some filings, an advisory role attributed to individuals formerly affiliated with the office of the First Lady. Now the room was awake. She didn't pause. I'd like to ask this committee and any relevant agency a simple question. Are we tracking which private foundations influence these funding streams? And should the former First Lady's name be this close to a facility that shackled 9-year-olds? The room didn't just fall silent, it froze. A few chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. The panelist across from her, a former prosecutor from Florida, narrowed his eyes but said nothing. The committee chair looked like he'd misheard. But Jasmine wasn't finished. I'm not accusing anyone of misconduct. I'm asking why we're so comfortable ignoring proximity. No outrage in her tone, no fury, just a mirror. It hung in the air like smoke. One of the Republican members finally spoke. Congresswoman, are you suggesting that Melania Trump directly funded border detention centers? Jasmine didn't blink. I'm suggesting that public names carry public consequences. If a foundation uses the prestige of a former First Lady to gain influence, then that connection deserves scrutiny, especially when taxpayer dollars are involved. The chairman cleared his throat, fumbling for neutral ground. Your time is up, Congresswoman. But it wasn't. Not really. Because somewhere in that 5 minutes, something had cracked. That evening, Lane sat in Jasmine's office, watching as the clip was reposted again and again. 10 seconds, then 20, then the full 5-minute segment. It started slow, a few thousand views. A thread on Reddit. A tweet, with barely any engagement. Then it hit TikTok. A 19-year-old pre-law student in Phoenix posted a stitched clip. Jasmine asking the question, followed by still images from the 2018 child separation crisis. It went viral in 3 hours. Then came the headlines. Congresswoman questions former First Lady's role in border facility funding. Jasmine Crockett draws line between philanthropy and accountability. Is grace a distraction? But the one that stuck came from a small outlet in El Paso. Be best. For who? By the next morning, Jasmine's inbox was a war zone. Not just hate mail, that was expected. But something stranger. Whispers. A former Homeland Security clerk, an anonymous whistleblower from a border logistics firm, a community organizer in McAllen who'd been trying to trace subcontractor routes for years. They weren't offering testimony, not yet. But they were watching. Because Jasmine hadn't said anything outrageous. She hadn't accused anyone. She'd simply asked the question that everyone else was afraid to touch. On Capitol Hill, reactions split. Some members rolled their eyes. Crockett's grandstanding again. Others watched quietly. Behind closed doors, staffers began cross-referencing previous grants with nonprofits that had civic heritage endorsements. One Democratic congressman from New Jersey texted Lane late at night. She didn't lie, but damn, she touched a wire. Lane replied with one sentence. She always does. Meanwhile, Trump posted, all caps, as expected. Disgusting smear by Crockett against America's most graceful First Lady. They hate beauty, they hate family, they hate patriots. Total witch hunt by the radical left. Cable news picked it up. Some anchors mocked her. Others showed just the, quote, cut mid-sentence to make it seem like she'd called for Melania's arrest. But the full clip, the uncut version, was gaining traction elsewhere. College campuses, immigration blogs, human rights circles. People were watching not because she yelled, but because she didn't. 2 days later, Jasmine was asked to appear on CBS Mornings. She declined. Instead, she uploaded a new video, not a rebuttal, not a press statement. Just her, seated at her desk, explaining the budget lines. No drama, no spin, just this. I asked because I've seen how the system treats those without a name. I've seen mothers separated from children because of paperwork. If Grace is going to wear a name, then Grace has to be accountable too. The video hit 500,000 views in 24 hours. And somewhere, quietly, a change was beginning. Not in the halls of power, not yet, but in the homes of people who finally saw the curtain slip and realized what had been hiding behind it all along. The wave didn't break all at once. It rose quietly then. Without warning, it crashed. The first aftershock came from Truth Social. Trump posted just after 10:23 p.m. Disgusting attack on Melania. Crockett should apologize immediately. They hate women who succeed. They hate beauty. They hate America. The post racked up shares instantly. Cable outlets went live within the hour, panels scrambling to book commentators who had only seen a screenshot of the hearing, not the hearing itself. On Patriot Channel News, a host wagged his pen like a sword. She wants to cancel a first lady. These radicals won't stop until they've erased every tradition this country stands for. Another segment called her unhinged, bitter, and jealous. But the fire was burning in the wrong direction, because when people looked for the clip, they found the full one. And when they watched it, most didn't find rage. They found something else. Poise, precision, a question. No yelling, no accusations. Just, should the former First Lady's name be this close to a facility that shackled 9-year-olds? It wasn't a weapon, it was a mirror. And the country was seeing something in it that many didn't expect themselves. Inside Jasmine's office, the lights were still on. Lane sat on the corner of the table, 2 phones in his lap, eyes darting between screens. CBS just called again. MSNBC wants a sit-down. HuffPost is working on a piece about ethics and philanthropic influence. He paused. And Fox is quoting you out of context. Jasmine was by the window, quiet, holding a mug of lukewarm tea she hadn't touched in an hour. They want me to punch back, she said almost to herself. But that's not the game. Lane nodded slowly. So what's the play? She turned, calm. We show them the work. The next morning, Jasmine's team uploaded a PDF to her website titled Public Oversight and Philanthropic Transparency in Federal Budget Allocations. No press release, no commentary, just page after page of documents. Highlighted excerpts. Dates. Dollar amounts. Board affiliations. Not a single sentence called out Melania Trump by name. But the data spoke louder than any insult could have. By noon, independent researchers were digging. Reddit threads were alive with side-by-side screenshots, photos of ribbon cuttings at border facilities next to grant approvals from rebranded foundations tied to Future Front. Then came the stories. An anonymous source verified by ProPublica submitted a leaked email chain from 2020 between DHS officials and a strategic partner in youth wellness. The email thanked the unnamed donor group for their discretion and patriotic support. The footer read, on behalf of the Future Front Foundation. Underneath, Executive Liaison, C. Horvath, the same name Lane had traced to Melania's communications office. Trump, meanwhile, kept posting. Each post louder than the last. Each one more disconnected from the facts. Some didn't mention Jasmine by name anymore, just referred to radical women and enemies of patriotism. But something was shifting. People weren't rallying the way they used to. Even some conservative voices hesitated. One columnist from a right-leaning op-ed board tweeted, Crockett didn't lie. She didn't yell. She asked a question that, if anyone else asked it, we'd call oversight. A small shift, but a real one. And then, like a drop match in dry grass, a podcast changed everything. The Politic Room, hosted by Brian Voss, a former Hill journalist turned independent commentator. The guest that week? Sonia Lavelle. Few people remembered the name, but she had served as Melania Trump's personal travel and scheduling assistant for 6 years. She'd never given an interview. Until now. I never planned to speak publicly, Sonia said, but I watched what happened to Congresswoman Crockett, and it made me realize silence can feel like complicity. The podcast was unpolished, no video, just voice. But it was honest. Sonia continued. There were always questions about timing, about affiliations. I remember one staff meeting where Melania said, "I don't want people going through my papers. I've been flexible." And I remember thinking, what does flexible mean when it comes to immigration paperwork? Brian Voss paused. You're saying she knew there were questions about her own status? I'm saying we all did, but no one wanted to be the one to say it. The quote hit CNN within an hour. By evening, it was everywhere. And Jasmine? She didn't say a word, because she didn't have to. In the days that followed, a new conversation began. Immigration lawyers, former DHS agents, and nonprofit watchdogs began publishing quiet confirmations. Old reports, buried audits, scanned documents no one had cared to read until now. One 2001 Slovenian television interview resurfaced, where Melania had mentioned working freelance before official approval. It had been dismissed as mistranslation for years. But now, it was evidence of a double-standard one that couldn't be ignored anymore. Jasmine remained still. She didn't tweet, didn't call for hearings, didn't respond to Trump. Instead, she filed legislation. Not flashy, not designed for headlines. A quiet amendment that required foundations affiliated with public officials to disclose grant intent, recipient records, and fiscal impact within federal budget cycles. It didn't even bear her name on the front, but it carried her fingerprints. And more importantly, it carried her tone. Measured, ethical, precise. One night, Lane found her sitting on the couch in her office, shoes off, folder in her lap. "People think you're planning a counterattack," he said. She looked up. "That's because they think politics is a boxing match." "And it's not?" She smiled faintly. "It's chess, and I just moved the queen without raising my voice." Then came a letter. Not from the press, not from a staffer, from a woman named Darnisha Fuller in Phoenix, Arizona. Inside was a photo of her daughter, 8 years old, holding a sign that read, "If kids without a name get cages, then kids with a name get questions." Darnisha wrote, "You didn't say anything cruel. You asked what we've been too tired to ask. And now, maybe, just maybe, they have to answer." Jasmine held the photo for a long time, then placed it in the same folder as Esteban's drawing. And still, she didn't fight. Not the way they expected. No shouting, no victory lap. Just a press conference with 5 words behind her on a simple blue backdrop. Same rules, same country. And this, I didn't ask my question to go viral. I asked it because I've watched too many people get punished for asking less. This isn't about Melania. This is about a system where some people glide, while others get interrogated at every checkpoint of their lives. If grace is real, then it can withstand a question. She didn't raise her voice once. But by the time she left the podium, no one could hear anything else. The first protest was small. Maybe 30 people. Teachers, students, 2 veterans, a grandmother in orthopedic shoes holding a sign made from an old diaper box. It happened in Mesa, Arizona, outside a courthouse where immigration hearings were scheduled every Thursday. Originally, the protest was supposed to be about expedited deportations and disappearing paperwork trails. But after Jasmine Crockett's clip went viral, the message shifted. One sign stood out: "If grace can fund a cage, then I can question the ribbon." Local news picked it up, just a 30-second segment. But it was enough. By the following Monday, a protest swelled in Shreveport, Louisiana, not a liberal stronghold, not a media hotspot, but people showed up anyway. One of them was Anna Ruiz, 27, born in Flagstaff to undocumented parents. She held a cardboard sign that simply read, "If she gets to stay, so should my dad." It wasn't political, it was personal. In Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, a barber named Harold Sims paused mid-fade when a client asked, "You seen the Jasmine thing?" He didn't look up, just said, "She didn't say anything I haven't said in this shop 100 times. Only difference is she said it on camera." The shop fell quiet. Then a voice from the back muttered, Yeah, but she said it better. The clip wasn't just viral, it was viral with intent. College debate coaches assigned it as viewing homework. Civics teachers showed it in class. In Lincoln, Nebraska, a high school senior named Terrence clipped a quote from her CBS appearance and used it for his speech final. If asking a question gets called an attack, maybe the real problem is the answer people are afraid to give. He got an A. But the most surprising shift came from somewhere few had expected. Inside conservative media. Not the anchors, not the syndicated firebrands. The writers, the interns, the readers. An anonymous post on a right-wing forum said, "I didn't vote for her, probably never will, but I watched the full clip. She didn't call for deportation. She didn't insult anyone. She asked a question, and now everyone's mad she did. Why?" It was the kind of post that didn't start arguments. It started doubt. And that's what worried the system more than outrage. Outrage can be monetized. Doubt? That spreads like mold in silence. Then came the data. Fact Check Now, an independent watchdog, published a 12-page report showing how at least 5 foundations tied to former administration figures had funneled millions into border operations under various vague humanitarian labels. They weren't illegal, but they were unaccountable. The most damning quote: "What Jasmine Crockett uncovered isn't a scandal. It's a pattern of plausible deniability." In Minneapolis, a former Army veteran named Andre Colvin, 58, sat in his backyard with a glass of iced tea and recorded a video on his phone. Birds chirped in the background. "I served this country," he said, "twice. Still get asked where I'm from. I don't know this Congresswoman. Never met her. But she asked a question I've been holding back for years. If that makes her un-American, then what does that make me?" The video hit 3 million views. Soon, young immigrants started posting their own stories under a new hashtag. "I am Jasmine." One read, "My mom was almost deported for a typo. One box on a form. Meanwhile, Melania gets to not remember things. And we're the threat?" Another, "They said she hates America. No, she loves it enough to ask why it lies to itself." The tide wasn't a flood. It was erosion, slow, relentless, reshaping everything. At a town hall in Birmingham, a college professor paused her lecture and turned to her students. "Let's talk about why this moment made people uncomfortable, and who's been comfortable for too long." Inside the Capitol, the tone was shifting. Jasmine's office started receiving fewer threats, more confessions, handwritten letters, emails with subject lines like, "I didn't know until I saw your clip. My dad was detained in 2007. Thank you for saying what others won't." And one that simply read, "Your question made me ask mine." Then came the interview. Not hers. Melania Trump's former advisor, Sonia Lavelle, reappeared on a podcast. She didn't offer proof. She offered memory. The timeline never made sense, and inside, we all knew it. But no one wanted to say anything, because grace protects the powerful, until someone asks what grace is built on. The quote landed everywhere. The White House refused comment. Trump fumed online. Cable panels debated tone, again. But they were no longer controlling the story. The story had become organic. And Jasmine? She kept moving. No press tour, no social media jabs. Just school visits, immigration center meetings, veterans forums, and one quiet amendment that was gaining traction, slowly, privately. A staffer from a moderate Republican's office even called Lane, asking for a clean copy. "No promises," she'd said, "but it's fair." That word fair suddenly meant more than partisan. It meant possible. At a public high school in Baltimore, Jasmine stood in front of a gym full of teenagers. No teleprompter. No fancy backdrop. Just a folding chair, a cracked mic, and a message. "You're going to be told a lot about who you are, what you deserve. And a lot of it won't come from facts. It'll come from fear. From people who need to keep you small. Because they're afraid of what happens when you start asking real questions. Let me tell you something. Asking questions isn't un-American. It's the most American thing there is. One kid clapped, then two, then the whole gym. No standing ovation, but just enough to say, "We heard you." And still, the echoes kept spreading. In Albuquerque, a mural appeared on a community center wall, Jasmine's silhouette. Behind her, a line in block letters, "If your name softens the truth, then maybe the truth deserves its own name." In Toledo, a Sunday op-ed ran with the title, "The Question Heard Around the Country." The writer, a 62-year-old pastor, closed with this: "We can argue tone, we can debate timing, but we cannot argue with the truth." And the only reason her question hit so hard is because deep down, we already knew the answer. And still, Jasmine didn't gloat, didn't brand it, didn't turn it into a campaign. Because it wasn't about her, it was about presence. About what happens when someone refuses to leave the room just because the air gets tense. The last scene wasn't televised. It happened in a hallway, 2 floors above the hearing chambers. A teenage girl, maybe 16, walked up to Jasmine as she was exiting a briefing. She didn't say hello, didn't ask for a selfie, just handed her a folded piece of paper and walked away. On it, handwritten in pencil, "I used to think I had to stay quiet. Thanks for showing me that I don't." Jasmine stood there, unmoving, then smiled. That quiet kind of smile, the kind that doesn't need a mic. Because she didn't change the system with outrage. She changed the temperature of the conversation and left behind a question the powerful couldn't stop hearing in their own silence. If this is what grace looks like, why does it leave so many of us locked out? Maybe it wasn't the question that unsettled them. Maybe it was the silence that followed, the kind of silence that doesn't beg for attention, but demands reflection. Because when someone like Jasmine Crockett stands up without raising her voice and asks what so many are too afraid to name, that's not confrontation. That's clarity. So let me ask you, have you ever been in a room where speaking the truth felt like a risk and staying silent felt like surrender? If you've ever had to measure your words more than your worth, if you've ever been told to smile through the discomfort, to keep your questions quiet, to wait your turn, then maybe this story isn't just about Congress or policy or power. Maybe it's about us. Because in a world where grace is often reserved for the few, dignity starts when we refuse to ask for permission to be seen. And courage? Sometimes it sounds just like a question asked calmly, but heard everywhere. If this story moved you, I invite you to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who still believes that questions, especially the quiet ones, can lead to something bigger than answers. And remember, she didn't raise her voice, she just refused to lower her gaze. I'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.